This is a special edition of Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, I'm taking you through the Leafs' entire roster for this weekend's Prospect Showdown against the Montreal Canadiens, taking place at Bell Center on Saturday and on Sunday. This is a change from recent years for the Maple Leafs. They've been recently playing in the Traverse City tournament against teams like Detroit, Columbus, Dallas. I believe St. Louis was there recently as well. They're no longer at that tournament. They're doing their own thing, a 2-game set against the Montreal Canadiens beginning this year in Montreal at Le Centre Bell. Now, this is something that we don't know a lot of details about so far because this is the first year that it's happening. I would guess that this is a partnership between the Leafs and Habs that will switch between Montreal and Toronto and go back and forth between the two cities. That's my expectation. We'll see if that's actually what happens, or if this is a case where the Habs are going to be hosting this for year after year and the Leafs are just going to be the partner, or if the Habs are going to have a rotation of people come through, or whatever it is. But what it is right now is going into this weekend, it is a 2-game set against the Montreal Canadiens for this Leafs rookie roster. They'll play, as I said, on Saturday and on Sunday. No games after that, just the 2 weekend games. And then after that, we're straight into Toronto Maple Leafs training camp. It comes around that quickly. The Leafs rookies have been together for a couple of days in Toronto with a couple of scrimmages, practices, getting ready before they leave to Montreal, playing at Ford Performance Center. We saw earlier on Thursday, Ben Danford go down with an injury. As I'm recording this the day of Thursday. Don't know his status update on Danford. We're hopeful that he'll be able to play this weekend and that he was just a little bit shaken up on a big hit and it's nothing serious, because that would definitely be a sting to this Leafs roster if we don't get to see Danford this weekend. You always want to see your first round pick in the prospect tournament when they're a junior age player and they're able to play. So if you're unfamiliar, the prospect tournaments are happening all across the league this weekend. It is all of the, as it says in the name, prospects, rookies across the league for those respective teams, and a handful of AHL signed players, ECHL signed players in respective organizations, as well as a handful of free agent invites, all coming together to play a couple of games before the main training camps begin for the NHL teams. This is partially because in the preseason and in the main training camp, these younger players don't get as much of an opportunity to play in those preseason games, so it gives the players a bit of a spotlight just before training camp begins to kind of showcase their talents at the beginning of training camp and maybe parlay that into a bigger role throughout the actual NHL training camp. We saw it last year with the Maple Leafs, where Easton Cowan had a phenomenal prospect tournament in Traverse City, parlayed that into some really good spots in the preseason, and eventually had an OHL MVP season that all dated back to him having a very good prospect tournament. So it's something that, at the end of the day, doesn't really mean anything, but especially in this new iteration with the Leafs going up against the Habs, and the Habs having this rebuilding roster with a lot of high-end draft picks on their team, there's a lot at stake for kind of the egos of these players going in as an underdog Maple Leafs team against a Habs team that has the likes of Lane Hudson, a top 10 pick, and David Reinbacher, like a lot of elite talent coming up in the pipeline on this Montreal roster. This Leafs team does not have that kind of depth or high-end talent. You've got Easton Cowan there, you've got Fraser Minten there. I'll get to all those players in a minute here, but it is very much an underdog team for Toronto going into Montreal. So there's a lot of stakes kind of for the players going in to go out and show themselves and prove themselves against a rival of the Maple Leafs organization, even though these games don't actually mean anything at the end of the day. So without further ado, I think it's best to just dive into the roster. I'm going to go player by player, the players that we've already previewed on the Camp Countdown. I'm going to go a little bit quicker on, and if you want the full deep dive, circle back to those players. But this is going to be mainly going over the entire roster. At the end, going through the entire roster, I might talk about some potential combos or some things that I'm interested to see, but I might also hit on that throughout the show. And then at the end, I'll also talk a little bit about the Montreal roster and some players to keep an eye on there as well. Going to be doing this in numerical order, so starting with the forwards and then the defensemen and then the goaltenders. I think I'm going to put timestamps in the description. We'll see if I actually get around to doing that. Starting with number 33 forward Roni Hirvonen, playing in his second prospect tournament for the Maple Leafs. Roni Hirvonen, we're going to get to it shortly. Within the next week or two on Camp Countdown, I got a great guest lined up for Hirvonen, but just an unfathomable few months for Roni Hirvonen last year, where he sustains a concussion at development camp. His father dies unexpectedly in surgery for the cancer treatment that he was undergoing. And a few months after that, he takes an errant stick to the face, catches him in the eye, and there's doubt over whether he will ever be able to play hockey again. Ultimately, he is able to recover and he finishes the season, returning about 3 months after that injury happened. Finished off the season playing with the full bubble. Thankfully, he's back playing with the visor, which means that he's in a good enough space where he doesn't need to be worried about his vision or damaging his eye or anything like that. So that's a good sign going into the season. So for Hirvonen, yeah, he's one of the older, more experienced players on this roster as a 2020 draft pick already. He's going to turn 23 in the middle part of this season. Coming off of an decent, I think you could say, rookie season with the Marlies, taking into account the unbelievably difficult season that he went through personally. So I'm hoping for a bigger year from Hirvonen with all of those personal challenges behind him, and that begins this weekend at the prospect tournament. So I'm hoping for big things and a good showing from Hirvonen this weekend. We move on to the second forward on the roster, and that is number 39, Fraser Minten. Really, there isn't a lot to say about Minten at this point. You guys know the situation with him. He's done his junior career. He's not going back to Saskatoon, even though he was hanging out at their training camp before coming back to Toronto. He is 20 years old, doesn't need to go back to junior. He's eligible to play for the Marlies. That's likely where he's going to start the season. Captained Canada at the World Juniors last December. Went back to junior after playing for the Maple Leafs to start the season. Was briefly the captain in Kamloops and then was traded to Saskatoon, where he had a great second half of the season, returning there. Maybe not the offensive output that we were hoping to see with 19 goals, 38 points in 36 games. That's pretty much in line with what he did the previous year with the Blazers, and not the offensive production you would hope for in the playoffs as well, with 8 goals, 14 points in 16 games. But the two-way ability Minten showed last season and the maturity of his game last season, where Saskatoon had other players that they could rely on to be the heavy lifters offensively, the Trevor Wongs, Yegor Sidorovs, even Brandon Lisowsky a little bit. Those kind of players they could lean on offensively. He was a dominant, shut-down centerman at the top of that lineup, and was one of the best players in the WHL playoffs, even if the point totals don't match kind of that moniker. So a big tournament for him coming up if he wants to push to make the Leafs out of camp again. He's probably going to need some players to be traded off of the NHL roster if he's going to push into that lineup. All things considered, another big tournament for Fraser Minten, which is probably his last prospect tournament, because this year he's turning pro, and if he has the kind of season we expect from him, maybe we see him again at next year's prospect tournament and kind of one final hurrah if he plays the full season with the Marlies. But there's a chance that this is his final prospect tournament for the Maple Leafs. Again, we're going to dive more into him soon with another fantastic guest. That's going to be one of the shows to watch coming up shortly. We continue on with our first free agent invite. That's number 42, Maxim Muranov from the Calgary Hitmen. He is, as I said, a free agent invite. And he's a curious case because he's a 2004 born player, so he would count as an overage player returning to the junior ranks. And he's also Russian, which means he would count as an import player, as he'd previously played in the KHL. He's not somebody, or I should say the Russian kind of junior system. He wasn't one of those players that was drafted out of kind of the Ontario ranks after coming to Ontario at like 14, 15 years old that we see for a few of those Russian players. I believe Semyon Durgachintsev is somebody that did that a few years ago, was just kind of a name that most Leafs fans would remember. Muranov last year really kind of popped off, where he scored 22 goals after previously having a career high of 6 in the WHL with Calgary. Put up 50 points in 63 games as well, was a plus 29, really good two-way ability. I really liked kind of the shot that he showcased at development camp as well. He's an interesting player because he is technically eligible to sign an AHL contract if the Maple Leafs want him to, and because he would count as both an overage player and a import player if you return to any junior team in the Canadian Hockey League, I think there's at least a chance that if he has a good tournament here and maybe goes to Marlies camp, that he could end up signing a contract and maybe playing with ECHL Cincinnati, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. At this point, he's going to be one of the depth players that probably gets into just one game this weekend, one of the 2 games. But if he impresses and gets that first game opportunity, maybe he gets the second game as well. Continuing on, number 45, Robert Mastrosimone, officially announced this week as he's back on an AHL contract that was previously reported earlier in the summer, so it made sense that he would be on this roster as well. Former Detroit Red Wings prospect, played most recently in the NCAA with Arizona State. Previously to that, played at Boston University, a second-round pick by Detroit back in 2019, came to the Marlies and played the full season in the AHL. He didn't spend any time with the Newfoundland Growlers last year. Only the 4 goals, but 15 points in 45 games, and really started to round into form in the back half of the season. Started to find some chemistry down the lineup with some guys like Zach Solo, and made an impact to the point where even though he only played 45 games in the regular season, he played in all 3 playoff games for the Marlies. I was very happy to see him come back on an AHL contract because he's still only 23 years old. So he's a player that is still on the younger side, especially for those guys coming out of the collegiate ranks. 1 season in the AHL under his belt, some really good underlying numbers there as well. I think he's a player to keep an eye on that could enter an NHL contract by the end of this upcoming season if he has a big year with the Marlies, which if he gets the opportunity to, I could definitely see him doing that. So he's somebody that I could also see mixing in with some of the top players in this lineup, the guys like Fraser Minten, the Nikita Grebenkins, the Easton Cowan types. I could see Mastrosimone getting some more of those minutes versus last year's prospect tournament where he was one of those guys that kind of mixed in the bottom 6. Moving along, really excited to see him on this roster. Number 49, Ty Voit. Only played 6 games last year in his rookie season as a professional. Was injured in his first game with the Marlies after being injured in the prospect tournament phase last year. So he got a late start to the season, went to the Newfoundland Growlers to start the season, had 5 games there, 2 goals, 8 points total. Definitely looked above the ECHL level, which you wanted to see from Ty Voit given his skill level coming out of the junior ranks. But again, was injured in that first game with the Marlies, sustained a shoulder injury, needed season-ending surgery. So we only got to see 6 games of Ty Voit as a professional player last season. Considering he ended his junior career with 105 points in 67 games with the Sarnia Sting, he is somebody that I am fascinated to see where he slots in and how he plays this year after what was essentially an entire lost season due to a couple of injuries last year. I'm really hoping for a big showing from him this weekend in the prospect tournament because we also didn't get to see him at development camp as well. Going to be a big season for Ty Voit to prove that he's not too small for the professional game, that he can handle the physical rigors of the game, can stay healthy, and that begins, as I said, this weekend at the Prospect Showdown. The big dog, number 53 out of Strathroy, Ontario, Easton Cowan. The London Knights star player, first-round pick in 2023, OHL MVP, OHL playoff MVP, and probably would have been like a Memorial Cup MVP had the London Knights won that title and didn't lose that in the dying seconds of the final against Saginaw. He's going to be pushing for an NHL roster spot. It's NHL or junior hockey for him this season. I recommend checking out my full conversation earlier in the summer with Scott Wheeler, where we dived into everything about Cowan's game, tenacity, speed. He is so much fun to watch. He really popped off at last year's prospect tournament. I expect him to do the same this weekend because he's going up against the Montreal Canadiens playing in Bell Center. And if you know anything about Cowan and what he did last year with the London Knights, he loves that big game attitude. He loves to show up and show out against some of those top teams in the OHL last year and show up in those big spots. This is a big spot for Cowan. He's looking to make the NHL roster, and what a better way to start off your training camp by pushing for an NHL roster spot by showing out at Bell Center. And so if we see an Easton Cowan goal in the 2 games this weekend, which you would hope that we get, just considering he's the best player on the Leafs roster, and the Leafs roster doesn't have the same talent level, at least the high end, as the Montreal Canadiens roster does. I wouldn't be surprised if we get one of his patented stare-down sellies at Bell Center, which I don't want to know what the reaction to that is going to be. I don't want to know the discourse after something like that, but it will be really, really, really fun if we do get to see that. Number 61, Jacob Quillan, the free agent pickup out of Quinnipiac last spring, joined the Marlies at the end of the season after scoring 17 goals, 46 points in 39 games with the Bobcats last season, leaving the collegiate ranks a little bit early, had a little bit of eligibility left, decided to go pro at the end of last season, made his pro debut with the Marlies at the end of the season, only had the 1 assist in the 10 total games across the end of the regular season and the playoffs. He did play in all 3 playoff games, which I think says a lot about him earning the trust of the coaching staff at the end of the season as well. And he's somebody that is going to be an intriguing piece to watch this upcoming season with the Marlies. Of course, not as familiar with his game, just coming as a free agent. He's not somebody that I've been tracking for multiple years in the system. He's a new piece to the system, but he's an average size center, and the Leafs need center prospects, and he's definitely that, and played at the end of the season with the Marlies and is one of the top centers on this roster right behind Fraser Minten. He's going to be playing top 6 minutes. He's going to be playing with kind of the second tier guys. He's probably going to play with Robert Mastrosimone. He's probably going to play with Roni Hirvonen in this tournament this weekend. So for Jacob Quillan, not somebody that's going to be pushing for NHL minutes at the start of the season by any means, but we saw a couple years ago now when Alex Steeves was brought in and he immediately became a top 6 player for the Toronto Marlies. The hope will be that by the end of the season, Jacob Quillan can kind of match that accelerated timeline, considering he will be 23 years old in February. So one of those collegiate free agent signings, a little bit on the older side, making his professional debut. He's not the 21-year-old type that is coming out of junior hockey and playing that pro rookie season. 22 years old, you kind of want to see a little bit more from him as a rookie. As I've said again, that begins this weekend at the prospect tournament, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him playing with guys like Hirvonen and Mastrosimone in this lineup. Number 63, Braeden Kressler, finally beginning his professional career. He was eligible to play pro last season. The Leafs opted to return him to the junior ranks for an overage season, and I agreed with that call last fall because you look at his career. He played as an OHL rookie in 2019-20. Then he missed an entire season due to COVID and the season being shut down. The Leafs signed him after a really impressive showing at development camp and the prospect tournament as a free agent invite. They sign him as an undrafted player. He returns to Flint and deals with injury issues and can't really get any rhythm going. Returns to Flint the next season, has some injury issues, and plays well, but again, doesn't really have that same rhythm. Jumped to 25 goals and 52 points in 47 games that season, leading into last year's prospect tournament. The Leafs decided to return him to junior rather than play him with the Growlers. And again, he had a really solid season where he split the year between Flint and then got flipped to Ottawa at the trade deadline. Very similar numbers across those 2 stints with those 2 teams, and was pretty good in the playoffs for Ottawa as well, with 6 goals in 10 games. He's out of junior eligibility. That was his last season. He will be playing pro games this year. I don't know if he's going to start with the Marlies. I think it might be best for him to start with ECHL Cincinnati, see if he can put up some numbers, and then maybe make a jump to the bottom 6 for the Marlies. But Kressler's a player that I got a lot of time for. He plays with tenacity. He plays with pace. Sure, he's undersized, but he's that water bug type player where he can create a little bit of offense around the net. He's somebody that is a pretty good playmaker as well. As I mentioned, plays with kind of that tenacity, that speed, and is pretty good defensively as well. There's enough pieces there where I think that there could be a player here that plays on your fourth line still. But after some injury derailments and finally having a healthy season last year as a 20-year-old in the junior ranks, it's time to see what he can do as a pro. And as I mentioned, signed as an undrafted free agent after impressing at prospect tournaments. This is what got Kressler on the map for the Leafs. This is what got him the NHL contract. Let's see what he can do in this prospect tournament, potentially playing with some of those guys that we've already previously mentioned. Just because he's going to be playing pro games this year, they might want to get him some spots with some of those guys that have some pro experience. Number 66, Marshall Finnie. Now, this is an interesting one because this is the player that hit Ben Danford on Thursday that potentially injured him for this weekend. It's an unfortunate reality of these situations where you want to be a safe environment to not hinder any of these prospects going into their main seasons or derail the start of important seasons, especially for Danford coming into his draft plus 1 year. But at the same time, you want to foster a competitive environment and a physical environment to get the players ready for a physical couple of games this weekend. And it's an unfortunate reality because we saw last year at development camp Roni Hirvonen get run over by Nolan Dillingham and sustain a concussion there. Don't know what the injury report is yet on Danford, but it's unfortunate that somebody like Marshall Finnie has to be on the opposite side of that, just like how Nolan Dillingham was on the opposite side of it last year. Finnie is in his final season of junior eligibility. He's almost too old to play in junior hockey as a January 2nd, 2004 birthday. If he was born a couple days earlier, he would be too old and would be looking to sign an AHL contract or something like that. I don't think it's particularly likely that he signs just because we've seen the Edmonton Oil Kings make a couple of moves to create some space for him to return for this upcoming year. I think it's more likely where if the Leafs like what they see from him, they circle back at the end of this junior season. But this is a very physical player. 21 goals in 67 games last year with the Oil Kings, 41 points, 120 penalty minutes. This is a physical, big body center winger who is going to create some havoc in the games that he gets into this weekend. Whether it's one, whether it's two, remains to be seen. But he's a 6'2" frame, will mix it up at the bottom of a lineup, has well over 200 career penalty minutes in the WHL in 2 seasons played there. He's going to be a teammate of Miroslav Holinka with the Oil Kings this year. He's somebody that I wouldn't be surprised back in the Leafs organization this time next year on an AHL contract. Speaking of AHL contracts, number 68, Matthew Barbolini, coming out of Miami, Ohio in the NCAA on an AHL contract with the Marlies. In 31 games last year, scored 11 goals and 25 points on a Miami team that really kind of struggled. Didn't have a lot of help last year, did Barbolini, and he's somebody that has some sneaky skill, has some size to him as well, and could be one of those diamond in the rough players. I could actually see him playing a bit more of a role on the Marlies than maybe we expect right now. I could also see him playing a big role with ECHL Cincinnati. He's 24 years old, so he's on the older side definitely of these kind of collegiate-aged guys making their pro debuts. He's had 1 assist in 9 games at the end of the season last year with the Marlies. He didn't play in the playoffs. He's somebody that probably gets into both games this weekend in his first prospect tournament in the Leafs organization, and actually his first prospect tournament as a first-year pro coming out of the collegiate ranks. He's somebody that I wouldn't be surprised makes an impression this weekend just because he's a bigger frame player, plays on the wing, can play center if you need him to as well, and has some sneaky skill and puck handling ability. He's somebody that I expect to play third, fourth line over the 2 games, but like I said, could get into both games and maybe make an impression just because of some of the skill level there. Probably the player I'm most excited to see this weekend is number 71, Nikita Grebenkin. Be sure to go back and check out my episode with Brian Stewart, Break Stew 86, on Grebenkin. Great conversation with him. One of his biggest fans in the Leafs space. Coming over from the KHL is Grebenkin in his first prospect tournament after putting up 19 goals and 41 points in 67 games. in the KHL last season. Finished second on Magnitogorsk in scoring behind Danila Yurov, was a great player for them in the postseason, even though he was banged up and playing through injuries. Because he was banged up and playing through injuries, we didn't see him on the ice at development camp, and so this is going to be the first time we see Grebenkin on the ice in competitive games in North America. Very excited for that possibility. We're going to see him probably with Easton Cowan and Fraser Minten this weekend based off of what we saw in the prospect scrimmage on Thursday. So he's going to be playing with the big dogs. Had a great season in the KHL last year. 2023 KHL Rookie of the Year, a prospect that has really blossomed over the couple of years since being drafted. 2003 born player, so he was drafted as an overager. So he's a little bit older than you might expect for a player drafted just 2 years ago. He's somebody I've got a really, really close eye on this weekend to see kind of what kind of player Grebenkin's going to be in the North American game, on the North American ice, and kind of see where his game is at leading into his first pro season in North America. Number 81, Sam McCue, 7th round pick this past summer of the Owen Sound Attack, split last season between Owen Sound and Peterborough in the OHL. Bagged 23 goals last season in the OHL after really struggling as a rookie. Did not get a lot of ice time as a rookie the previous year in Peterborough. Had 0 goals and 1 assist in 33 games. Compare that to this past year where, as I said, had 23 goals as an OHL sophomore and was traded midseason to a new team. We'll see what we get from McCue this upcoming season. He's on the older side of first-year eligible players from last year's draft as an October 2005 birth date. So he's somebody to keep an eye on that if he has a good season, could make the jump to the Marlies as soon as next year. But as a 7th round pick, I think it's a lot more likely that we see him play at least a couple seasons in the OHL going forwards here. He's somebody that, even though he's an NHL draft pick, could potentially be one of those guys that only plays 1 game this weekend, but we'll kind of see how they do the mix. There's 15 forwards on the roster, which means that there's 3 guys that are going to have to rotate in and out of the lineups to get everybody in. McCue is probably one of those guys playing at the bottom of a lineup that might just get into 1 game, but maybe we see them prioritize the junior age draft pick over 1 or 2 of the free agent invites / AHL contracted players. Number 85, Sam Stevens out of Boston University signed an AHL contract this spring with the Marlies, played 1 game at the very end of the season with the Marlies. He is definitely ECHL Cincinnati bound. Had 10 goals, 17 points in 40 games last season with BU as a depth center on that star-studded roster. He's somebody that the Leafs are hoping can be that kind of 4th-line projection if he ever makes it to the NHL, be a very good 2-way center. And so he's somebody that I don't think we're going to see big offensive production out of. But for example, this weekend, if you're talking about penalty killers, wouldn't be surprised to see Sam Stevens in one of those roles. Whether he plays 1 or 2 games this weekend remains to be seen. As I said, never really a big point producer in his career at Boston University, but was a trusted 2-way center that put up some good defensive results, especially his last 2 years at BU. He's somebody to keep an eye on that could push for 4th-line center minutes with the Marlies by the end of the season if he has a good year with ECHL Cincinnati. Continuing on, 2 forwards left here. Number 96, Brandon Lisowsky. Has been to a couple of prospect tournaments already with the Maple Leafs. Has showed pretty well at those as well. Bagged a few goals, if I remember correctly, in Traverse City last year. Ultimately, he didn't get that NHL contract at the end of the season. Went undrafted, re-entering the draft, and so he is a free agent. But the Leafs organization is still interested, and he likes the organization enough that he came back to both development camp and the prospect tournament without a contract in place. 42 goals, 80 points, 68 games last year. Didn't quite put up the numbers I think he was hoping for in the playoffs with 7 goals in 16 games, 17 points there. Lisowsky is a player that I've consistently described as like a lesser version of Nick Robertson, where they have a lot of same characteristics as kind of these smaller wingers with really good shots that play with a little bit of pace and tenacity and kind of water bug mentality, but you wonder what the NHL upside is for a player that's a lesser version than Nick Robertson, who already took a couple years to kind of find his footing in the NHL. So the Leafs didn't sign Lisowsky. I wouldn't be surprised if we see him still in the organization on an AHL contract after he plays his overage season in junior. And then we kind of see where things go from here. But at the very least, he has one more opportunity to show the Leafs that he deserves a contract. We'll see if he can do that this weekend with a big performance against Montreal. Finally, on the forward group, the star from the development camp this summer, number 98, Miroslav Holinka, the right-handed center out of Trinec in Czechia, coming over to North America this year to play with the Edmonton Oil Kings. Had 20 goals, 41 points in 29 under 20 games in the Czech League. Also got into 16 games with Trinec in the main Czech League and had a goal, 3 points in 16 games there. The skill level with Holinka is obvious. He was so dynamic at the prospect showcase earlier this summer at development camp in that scrimmage, where the skill level is legit, contributed to a goal or two. Really just an impressive player, making his debut in an NHL setting as a recent draft pick, coming out of the 5th round this year as a first-year eligible player. Born in 2005, so he's somebody that could play with the Marlies sooner rather than later if he impresses this year with Edmonton in the WHL. He could also go back to Czechia and maybe play a couple years and then come back. We'll see what the path is like for Holinka based off of what he shows this year in Edmonton. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a big season from Holinka and maybe some highlights this weekend at the Prospect Showdown. He's somebody that really caught my attention at development camp this year. Like, just his ability is really, really impressive. And he's, again, somebody that we're going to get to pretty soon on Camp Countdown for a full episode on him. Transitioning now to the back end. 8 defensemen on this Leafs roster, which means that there are 2 that will have to rotate between the 2 games. We'll see if the Leafs opt to do that for the bottom pairing and just swap the bottom pairing for a game, or if we see a couple of guys higher in the lineup take a game off and see maybe a bit of a lesser lineup for one of the 2 games. Part of that is going to do with the health of Ben Danford, number 38 on this roster, the right shot defenseman drafted in the 1st round this year by the Maple Leafs. Had 1 goal, 33 points in 64 games last season with the Oshawa Generals. In 21 games going all the way to the OHL finals, had 4 goals in the playoffs and 10 points. His defensive skating really stands out. And I think if he gets the opportunity to play this weekend, if he's healthy enough to play, it's going to be a great test for him going up against some of those top guys on the Montreal roster and get that kind of opportunity to play first, second pairing minutes, play on the penalty kill, first time doing all that kind of stuff in a legit setting with that Maple Leafs logo on his chest. Going to be fun to see if, of course, we do actually get to see Danford play, because his status for this weekend is unclear at this time. For more on Danford, check out the first episode of Camp Countdown all the way back with Brock Otten. That was a great conversation with him. We dive very deep into his skills and strengths and weaknesses as a player. One of my favorite episodes that we've done so far, and it was the first one as well. Topi Niemela on the roster as well, number 47, after his first season with the Marlies, was a consistent presence on the Marlies' top 4, and now the focus goes from making that rookie season debut with the Marlies to now how far away from the NHL is this player. The knock on him is the average size and whether that can lead to him being good enough defensively in the NHL, even though his intelligence and his defensive game has good enough qualities to potentially do that. Does he have the size to do it at the NHL level? I think last year he showed he has the size to do it at the very least in the American League. Put up 8 goals, 39 points in 68 games last season with the Marlies, kind of finding more of that offensive game that he had back in 2022 in the Finnish League, less so that we saw in his final season in Finland, where his production kind of took a step back. The question for Niemela, in addition to the size at 6'179", a very average size defenseman, if leaning on the smaller side, is whether he can be an impactful player enough at even strength, because he's probably not going to be a power play quarterback in the NHL. Maybe some power play 2 minutes, but that's basically the ceiling there. And he's probably not going to be one of your primary penalty killers either, just because of the lack of size. But maybe we do see him take more of a penalty killing role if he gets more of that opportunity this upcoming season. But he's not the Cade Webber, Yanni Hakanpää, even Chris Tanev types that are those bigger frame players. Even Justin Hall is a 6'3" player and played on the Leafs penalty kill basically every time they were shorthanded a couple years ago. He's not in that kind of frame, so the special teams ability remains a question mark for Niemela. We'll see what kind of role he plays this weekend. Wouldn't be surprised to see him as the power play quarterback and play some big minutes this weekend, going up again against some of those top players on the Habs roster. Probably the last prospect tournament for Niemela coming up as he turns 23 at the end of March this season. Number 52, one of the big wild cards coming into camp this year. Number 52, Cade Webber, acquired by the Maple Leafs before the trade deadline for a 6th round pick. They signed him to an NHL contract after his season ended at Boston University, burning that first year of his entry-level contract. This player has no offense to his game. Had a career high of 6 points at Boston University, scored 1 goal over 4 seasons at Boston University. This is not a player that will bring anything in the offensive zone. He's also 6'6", 6'7", depending on where you look, 200 plus pounds based off of the Boston University website, and is already 23 years old. He's somebody that, if he has a good enough start to the season, could potentially push for NHL minutes sooner rather than later because of his elite penalty killing coming out of the collegiate ranks. He was one of the best penalty killers in college hockey, set a block shots record since that stat has been kept track of in the NCAA last season, played a ton of shorthanded minutes for Boston University, and we'll see if that translates to the professional ranks here. The Leafs liked him enough to trade for his rights, even if it was only a 6th round pick. They still traded for his rights, still liked him enough to sign him to an NHL contract at the end of last season and burn that first year of his entry-level contract to get him into the organization. They don't have really any prospects like him, just at that huge frame and extreme defensive leaning player with no offense to his game. We're probably going to see him paired with Topi Niemela this weekend, which could very realistically be a pairing with the Marlies to start the season as well. Very, very interested to see Cade Webber in game action, just because it's one thing to be that kind of pure defensive defenseman at the collegiate ranks with no offense and struggling to handle the puck and skate the puck out. It's a different thing to do it at the professional ranks, and that challenge begins this weekend at the Prospect Showdown. He has enough ability to where I'm intrigued by the player in terms of puck handling and movement. It's by no means a strength of his game or an elite trait or anything like that. But if it's to the point where he's deferring so much to Topi Niemela, that's an issue. I want to see some confidence from him doing certain things this weekend as well. But he's going to get big minutes shorthanded this weekend. It's going to be a situation where we're going to see him basically play a role with the Marlies that he would probably play in the NHL if he makes it there as well, just as that pure defensive defenseman penalty killing type. If he can make it to the show, that's great as one of those unique type players, a Yanni Hakanpää type even. We'll see how he does this weekend in his first showing in a Maple Leafs jersey. Continuing on, number 58, Noah Chadwick, played at Team Canada's camp this past summer, is on the radar of Team Canada for the World Juniors this upcoming December. Check out my conversation with Mitch Brown as we dive deep into Noah Chadwick's game after a breakout season with the Lethbridge Hurricanes. Was a late round pick this time last year. Did not have a lot of fanfare coming into last season. Had some intriguing track numbers, underlying metrics as a 6'4" defenseman, but did not really have the profile that made you go, wow, this is a player to keep an eye on. And that's why he went 185th overall in the 6th round in 2023. But he popped offensively last year, bagged 12 goals, 56 points in 66 games. He was named captain of the Lethbridge Hurricanes going into this upcoming season. He's got a chance to play for Canada at the World Juniors, and he's going to have a big role this weekend at the prospect tournament. If he's healthy, we'll probably play with Ben Danford. If Danford can't go, he'll probably play with somebody like Ryan McCleary or Rhett Parsons, one of those types. For Chadwick, still obviously at least a year away from making that professional debut and going into his final season of junior hockey. There's a lot of expectations for him to take another step, kind of develop a bit more of that skating ability, pop a little bit more, even offensively, taking even more of that role rather than kind of showcasing that early in the season last year and building into that role. He's the guy going into this season, and I'm excited to see what we get from him with Lethbridge this upcoming year. As I said, check out my conversation with Mitch Brown for more on Chadwick. Definitely a player to keep an eye on in the Leafs organization. Number 62, Ryan McCleary, former Pittsburgh Penguins draft pick, went unsigned by them, finished his junior eligibility this past season with the Swift Current Broncos, and was signed officially to an AHL contract by the Marlies this week. 6'3" right-handed defenseman, has some mobility, has a physical side to him, good defensively. 11 goals, 36 points in 56 games last year with Swift Current. Maybe a bit more of goal scoring or offense than you would maybe expect for a player of that mold. The Leafs liked him enough after development camp to sign him to an AHL contract. We'll likely see him play big minutes this year with ECHL Cincinnati, and he's definitely a player to keep an eye on. He wasn't a player that ultimately was somebody that the Penguins or the Leafs were willing to commit an entry-level contract for as a 7th round pick back in 2021, but he's at least got an intriguing enough profile between the good skating, a bit of offensive ability, physicality, and defensive game where he could definitely be one of those AHL contract guys that eventually earn a regular role with the Marlies and eventually get an NHL contract. But that's a couple years down the road. For now, we're looking at McCleary as one of those guys that is probably going to mix into this lineup this weekend, probably for one game. He's probably going to be one of those rotation pieces this weekend, and is somebody that we'll see more at Marlies camp and then in the ECHL with Cincinnati this season. Up next, number 82, Nathan Mays, the very last draft pick in this past summer's draft. 225th overall, Mr. Irrelevant, if you care anything about that label. 6'4" defenseman, June 2006 birthday, so on the younger side of the draft class as well. Plays with Spokane in the WHL. Physical player, had 58 penalty minutes in 68 games last year as a WHL rookie. I don't know too much about his game at this point. He's somebody that could play in both games as an NHL draft pick, or could be one of those guys that steps out of the lineup on the third pairing as the part of the two guys that need to come in and out of the lineup. He's probably not going to play a ton this weekend in the one, maybe two games that he gets. We won't see him in any preseason games or anything like that. He's very much a project draft pick by the Maple Leafs at the end of the 7th round. We'll see what he puts up this year with Spokane as a physical defenseman with size. 87, Rhett Parsons. This is an intriguing one because he was at development camp. He's out of junior eligibility, and he hasn't signed a contract for this upcoming season. Unlike Ryan McCleary, who signed that AHL contract coming into the prospect tournament, Rhett Parsons remains without a contract. He's 21 years old, August 2003 birth date. He's out of junior eligibility. He's 6'3", 200 pounds, very physical player with over 100 penalty minutes in the WHL last season, and as a rookie back in 2021. Has never really done anything offensively at that level, but this weekend in the game that he gets into, likely only playing one game, is Rhett Parsons. This is something where his game can kind of showcase more the physical side of his game. He can play more of the game that he wants to play versus the development camp setting or scrimmage setting where you're not looking to kill anybody by any means. So this weekend is definitely an opportunity for Parsons to show the more physical side of his game in the minutes that he gets. I wouldn't be surprised to see him start the season on an ECHL contract even, and kind of start his pro career in that way. Rounding out the defense group is number 97, Chaz Sharpe, out of the Mississauga Steelheads. And I can still say Mississauga because he will never play for Brampton. He finished his junior eligibility last year with the Steelheads, had 19 goals, 53 points in 67 games from the back end, made his AHL debut in the final game of the season. 6'3" right-handed defenseman with some offensive skill. November 2003 birth date as well, so even though he's out of junior eligibility, is one of the younger players that ran out of eligibility as a late 2003 birth date, and he's somebody that I think the Leafs kind of really like. He was partnered with the Ben Danford, Noah Chadwick types in development camp, and kind of the trio that they went with. It was a lot of Sharpe. He also signed a 2-year AHL contract in the spring rather than the 1-year contract that most of the other players signed. The Leafs clearly like this player in terms of a developmental project as a right-handed defenseman with some offensive skill and some size as well. He's somebody that I'm expecting to play some pretty consistent minutes this weekend, even play maybe a little bit on the power play, although that might just go to Niemela and Chadwick in those roles, maybe even Danford if he's healthy. But I wouldn't be surprised to see Sharpe get some run on the power play, and he's somebody that I've got a really close eye on this upcoming season with ECHL Cincinnati. Of all the AHL signed guys that are going to be playing with the new ECHL affiliate, he's the one that I think has the most NHL upside, and I don't usually say that about the defensemen as well because it's so difficult to break into the NHL lineup just because there's 6 defensemen versus 12 forwards. It's much more likely for those long shot prospects to make it as a forward, less so as defensemen. Sharpe is a guy that I think is worth keeping an eye on. Let's go to the goaltenders now. Dennis Hildeby is playing at this year's prospect tournament after his rookie season with the Marlies, setting a couple of setting a couple of Marlies rookie records among goaltenders in terms of wins, and his performance last season. Was the starting goaltender for much of the season, played 41 games, 21 wins, and .913 save percentage, was the starter for all 3 playoff games. Had a couple of ups and downs there. Ultimately, the Marlies did go out in that first round series against Belleville. And so Hildeby goes into his second season in the Leafs organization, at least in North America, and is a clear-cut starter. The Marlies, I don't know how the goalie split is going to be this weekend. We could see Hildeby play a full game, and then the 2 Russian goaltenders that I'll get to in a second split a game, or we could see Hildeby split a game and one of the 2 Russian goaltenders get a full game. I would like to see Hildeby play half of a game, and just because we've seen him in a full season in North America, we know he's going to be the Marlies starter to start the season if he's healthy. He's not really somebody that we need to see a full game out of at the prospect camp or the prospect showdown this weekend to really get things underway, unless the Leafs want at least one game with kind of the big dogs playing a big role, and then maybe a second game where it's a lot more rotation. Remains to be seen what John Gruden and the rest of the coaching staff like to do that way. Number 50, Slava Peksa. A roller coaster debut season in North America for Peksa. Played the entire season with Newfoundland, but went multiple weeks at a time without playing games. Totaled 19 games with Newfoundland last year, just 5 wins in that span, an .890 save percentage. There were some games that were not pretty. There were also some games where he was spectacular and made 40 plus saves. Like, this was very much an up and down season for Slava Peksa. I would imagine that Peksa is going to split a game, maybe with Akhtyamov, maybe with Hildeby. I think it's more likely that Hildeby or Akhtyamov get a full game and Peksa splits a start. But like I said, at the end of the season, he was somebody that was still going up and down between his performance. There was a game that he had 49 saves on 52 shots in the ECHL last season. There were also a bunch of games where he allowed 4 or more goals, including an 8-goal against performance in October. It was not a great debut season for Peksa. It's also a big change going from second-tier Russia to Newfoundland with like no Russian support, coming to a brand new area and not playing super consistent minutes. We'll likely see Peksa with Cincinnati this season. Whether he's the starter, whether he's the 1B situation remains to be seen, because we don't really know what the goaltending situation is going to be at those levels just yet. But for Peksa, it is very much a building up season after a rough debut season last year with the Growlers. And completing the roster, the third goaltender on this roster for the Maple Leafs is Artur Akhtyamov, who we're finally going to get to see play with the Maple Leafs this year at Prospect Tournament, and his first North American action since playing at the World Juniors a couple years ago in one game against Austria. Check out the full show with Greg Ballack on Dennis Hildeby, where we dive into his game and we dive into also the pros and cons of a goaltender that is 6'7". Akhtyamov, a recent episode this week of Camp Countdown, where Philippe Demas came onto the show to talk about his favorite prospect in the Leafs organization, who is coming over, as I mentioned on that show, after a really unique path in Russia the past few seasons. One playoff MVP is coming to the Marlies or Cincinnati Cyclones after winning that MVP title in the second tier league in Russia. Have no clue what we're going to see out of Akhtyamov this season. He could steal the starting job from Hildeby and look fantastic. Wouldn't be that surprised if that happens. He could also have a similar season to Slava Peksa, where he struggles coming over to North America and needs a bit of a rebuilding season. There is a wide range of outcomes for Akhtyamov here, and it begins this weekend at Prospect Showdown, where I hope he gets to play a full game. It is going to be important for Akhtyamov to get minutes and get minutes consistently this upcoming season. I hope we get to see him play a full game this weekend, start adjusting to that North American style before he goes to Marlies training camp and ultimately battles to be the backup to start the season to Dennis Hildeby. And so that's it. That's the entire roster for the Maple Leafs going into the Prospect Tournament this weekend. Because it is only the 2 games, there wasn't as much space for couple extra players that we've seen in past years, where the roster might be closer to 30 players in past years, and a couple more invites get into the lineup. Because it is 2 games instead of 3 games, which we've seen in past years, it's going to be a situation where there just wasn't room for a bunch of guys to get on the roster. And so some players like Max Diracolo, some guys like Nathan Pilling, those kind of players that were Jack Browdy as well, Dawson Cowan, that were all at development camp, didn't get the invite to the Prospect Showdown for the Maple Leafs this weekend and are at different prospect tournaments around the league this weekend. So a select few free agent invites in addition to the AHL signed guys getting an opportunity, and of course, the guys that we're going to be tuning in to watch, the Easton Cowan types, the Fraser Minten types, Ben Danfords, Topi Niemelas. Those guys are the key reasons why we're tuning in this weekend. I'm really looking forward to this. I love the idea of doing a weekend showdown against the Montreal Canadiens for this type of thing. I remember going to the prospect tournaments back in the day that were at Budweiser Gardens in London and loving those, of course, just because I'm a nerd, and getting autographs from guys like Martin Zirkles coming out of Latvia and a lot of fun things like that. For the Maple Leafs here, I think that there's really potential to make this a marquee event to begin training camp, where if it goes back and forth between Montreal and Toronto, you get the break in between where it doesn't become monotonous, and these guys are always coming here and they're always doing the prospect thing that ultimately not a ton of people care about. But if it's against the Habs, and if it's 2 games, and if it's relatively affordable tickets at the NHL rink to watch some of these young players play, I think there's an appetite for that in the fan base, and I think there's an appetite for that for young fans as well. One of the best things about going to those prospect tournaments back in the day in London was the fact that you got to see these young players make their debuts, but you also got to get autographs after those games and got to meet some of the players and chat with them briefly as you went down the line and got your autographs. That's just a really cool thing to get to do for young kids going to these kind of games, and something that we haven't had in the area for a long time because they've gone to Traverse City, they've gone to other tournaments outside of Ontario. I think it's a really cool thing if they do this back and forth thing with Montreal. If it ends up being that way, it could just stay in Montreal and maybe I'm out to lunch or whatever it ends up being. But I hope we see a back and forth here, and I hope we see this in Toronto in 2025. I think that there's a lot of potential for a tournament like this. Just a couple games on a weekend before training camp, middle of September, kids are just back into school. I think there's an appetite for something like that. So to wrap up here, quickly talking about the Montreal roster, some of the players that we're going to see Montreal ice this weekend in the couple of games. The key area that the Leafs have the advantage in is goaltending. The top goaltending prospect for Montreal is Jacob Fowler. He plays in college hockey. He's in school. He's not eligible to play in this weekend tournament. So in his place, it's Quentin Miller, a draft pick out of Rimouski, who had some pretty good numbers last year in the QMJHL. He'll likely get one of the games. And Samuel Richard, who you might remember as one of those emergency backups a couple years ago for the Maple Leafs, star goaltender with the University of New Brunswick out of AUS, 16 games last year, a .916 save percentage in the undefeated season that New Brunswick had. Really cool opportunity for Richard to get to play for the Habs this weekend. He likely gets a start this weekend because the Habs only have 2 goaltenders on their roster. That's the area that the Leafs have the advantage in. The high end of this roster is definitely in favor of the Habs in terms of having kind of those guys throughout the lineup. Lane Hudson is going to be playing NHL minutes this year. Logan Mailloux is going to be pushing for NHL minutes this year. Adam Engström comes over from Sweden after a really solid season with Rögle. And David Reinbacher is obviously a top 10 pick, right-handed defenseman who didn't necessarily have the best draft plus one season, but showed some of that ability at the end of the season with Laval, and is looking to have a really big campaign this year and then push for NHL minutes at some point this upcoming season. That is an elite top 4 for this Montreal team. Going to be some tough minutes for the likes of Minten, Cowan, Grebenkin, Hirvonen, those types to play up against those guys. Those are all very, very good defensemen for this kind of tournament. At forward, you're looking at players like Sean Farrell, coming off of his first season in the AHL last year, a dynamite player in his time at Harvard, dynamite player back when he played with Chicago in the USHL, player that Marley's GM Ryan Hardy probably a little bit familiar with. Other guys like Emil Heineman, a bit of a nasty player to play against, had 15 goals as an AHL rookie last year. Owen Beck had a big season last year, finishing the year with Saginaw, winning the OHL championship over Easton Cowan at the end of the season as well. He's going to be playing big minutes on this roster, and a first-round pick as well in Philip Meshar, who hasn't really popped the offensive numbers I think people were hoping for from him with Kitchener last year with 19 goals and 53 points in 47 games. He's going to be turning pro for the full time this upcoming season, looking to start off hot at this tournament, and he's going to get some key offensive minutes on this roster. Some other guys of note, Riley Kidney had a very good QMJHL career, struggled a little bit as an AHL rookie last year, looking to have a much better sophomore season. He's going to be a key center on this roster for the Habs this weekend. Luke Tuck, the younger brother of Alex Tuck, makes his pro debut this season after playing at Boston University. 30 points in 41 games last season at BU. He's going to play some key minutes this weekend as well. And somebody to definitely know, the younger brother of Arbor Jackeye, Florian Jackeye, is on this roster. 34 goals last season with Brantford in the OHL, a Habs draft pick, somebody that I think a lot of people, myself included, questioned that draft pick at the time, but he had a really good season last year in the OHL. We'll kind of see what he can do. He's a forward, so he's not like his older brother on the defensive side of the game. 6'4", like his older brother, will mix it up. Had 81 penalty minutes last year in the 63 games. Took that big step from 25 points the previous season to 34 goals and 65 points last year with the Bulldogs. He's under NHL contract. He's going to be playing with Laval this upcoming season. He's looking to have a good performance this weekend, and going up against the Leafs, wouldn't be surprised if we see a little bit of silliness between Jack Eye and somebody like a Rhett Parsons type or a Marshall Finnie or whoever. There's always something that you get at these prospect tournaments. But that's going to do it for this edition of Camp Countdown, a special edition going over the roster this upcoming year for the Prospect Showdown. I'm not quite certain what my coverage is going to be this weekend. I have a York broadcast on Saturday that starts at 4. I'm hoping to get to the football stadium a few hours early and hopefully watch the game and cover the game before the broadcast starts on Saturday. And then I have a work shift on Sunday that overlaps with the game. Lots of golf going on Sunday. So we'll see what the schedule looks like on Sunday as well. Should be able to keep closer tabs on the Sunday game, potentially. I don't know. We'll see how things go. But at the very least, it'll be a fun couple of games to watch this weekend. Don't have it confirmed where the game will be available to watch. I'm expecting it to be either on YouTube for both the Leafs and Habs, or on the team websites and apps. It'll be something like that. I don't know why they don't televise these anymore. It should absolutely be somewhere. It's probably a lack of Leafs TV thing, but I don't know why you wouldn't put a Leafs Habs rookie tournament game on a TSN4 on a Saturday and Sunday just before training camp starts. I guess they got a lot of football to show between college and NFL, so there might not be enough space. But I think that something like this between these two fan bases who are itching to watch hockey again might do some decent numbers, especially for September hockey. I would at the very least be comparable to the preseason games. But that's going to do it for this edition of Camp Countdown. We'll be back on Monday for a very good episode of Camp Countdown. That's going to do it for today's show. Enjoy the action this weekend, and we'll see you back on Monday. Have a good one.